So Jan, I see that the number of people are increasing. Are you having more people waiting for you to admit? Okay.
Hi, this is Erika.
Hi, Erika. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, I'm not going to put the video because my connection is not good.
No problem.
Okay.
Okay, it's 5:31 now. I think we can get started. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our Energy Innovation Network's webinar today. I hope everyone has had a good day so far and is staying healthy. My name is Na Yu. I'm currently the Vice President of Energy Innovation Network, and I'm your moderator today. I'm currently based in San Francisco, California. Right now, it is 5:30 here, and the weather outside is very beautiful and sunshine. I know we have audiences across all over the world and crossing different time zones. So thanks again for all of your participation. So this webinar today is actually the first event of our EIN's Global Clean Future Influencer Series. So the goal of this series is to invite individuals from both academia and industry who have had significant impacts in clean energy and sustainability to share their work and thoughts. So today we are very honored to have invited the Professor Daniel Kammen from UC Berkeley to be our first guest. He will talk about from COVID-19 to climate change, science and social innovations for a healthy economy. Also, I would like to take this chance to thanks to our 4 event partners, California China Climate Institute, Empower Innovation, Climate Link, as well as the Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization. So quick agenda today, we will spend the first 8 minutes for introducing our EIN, who we are and what we do. Then followed with the 15 minutes talk by Professor Kammen. After that, we will have 30 minutes for Q&A. A couple of notes here, since we have a quite large number of people on the line, please mute your audio during the webinar. And also, if you have any question during the webinar, please feel free to type any of your questions in the Zoom's chatting window. Our EIN staff will respond to your logistic questions. And for the questions regarding the talk, we will select some of them to Professor Kammen during the Q&A. Also, for anyone who is interested in joining the post-webinar discussion and connecting with the whole group, please feel free to join our Slack channel and the LinkedIn group page. The links will be shared in the chatting window as well. And also, this webinar is being recorded. We will share that on our website later. So first of all, let's see a brief summary of who we are, who you are, and where you come from. So among all of the registrants by country, majority of the registrants are based in US and China. We also have folks from Singapore, UK, and Malaysia, and Canada, and so on. By industry, we have people from energy, academia, research, engineering, consulting, environment, and so on. So we also have collected many interesting questions from our surveys, and we have selected some of them to Professor Kammen during the Q&A. Again, I want to thank you all for your participation. So who we are. Energy Innovation Network is a nonprofit organization founded at Stanford in 2015. We are all volunteer-based. Our vision is to strengthen the exchange of technology, research, business, and policy to advance a sustainable future. We have 3 main areas: energy, environment, and transportation. And we have 18 core members so far, and we are headquartered in Silicon Valley, California. We also have members crossing Colorado, Beijing, and Shanghai. So what do? We hold various events and conferences throughout the year to bring people together to share ideas and resources. For example, in 2019, we hosted our summit focusing on US-China energy and climate, as well as artificial intelligence in energy at Stanford. We had more than 200 attendees, and we received quite positive feedbacks. We also host the Global Clean Future Influencer Series as today's webinar to bring individuals who have had significant impacts in clean energy to share their ideas. And for investor and the startup mixture, we welcome investors, entrepreneurs, and industry experts to have in-depth talk on the latest technology trends, as well as potential investment opportunities. For lunch-on and the technical discussion, we bring people together to have discussions on chosen topics, such as opportunities and challenges on battery storage and so on. And this is like over lunch, but now we do virtual lunch. So if you are a professional, entrepreneur, academia, or venture capital, or NGO in energy and sustainability, we would love to hear from you. And if you're interested in knowing more about us, you can contact us using this email or visit our LinkedIn page as well as WeChat group. So currently we have 3 openings in our, on our website, strategy and sponsorship director, operation manager, and also our conference chair. So please reach out to us if you are interested in these positions. So with that, I would also like to share our several upcoming events hosted by EIN. The first one is our 2020 Inspire Summit. It is scheduled to be on September 5th, 2020 at Sunnyvale, California. The format would be a TED Talk style. Each talk would be like about 10 minutes. We recognize that climate change is having dramatically impacting all sectors. And the question is how we can explore cross-cutting opportunities for transformation. So the goal of this summit is to inspire cross-field collaboration and critical conversations to a more sustainable future. We have the speaker applications open right now. So we invite you or share this opportunity with the people who might be interested. The format would be in person if the situation allows, otherwise it will be online. Also, in addition to that, we have other 3 upcoming events and programs. The first one is our lunch on technical discussion about corporate sustainability on April 25th. We will have guests from retail, technology, and top research institutions to share their latest work. And the second one is our innovation and startup mixture, where the topic would be focusing on utility innovation trend analysis and the post-COVID-19 strategies for startups. And the third and the fourth would be 2 programs we are going to launch. One is the education program, where we will collaborate with professor such as Professor Daniel Kammen and also senior executives from industry to offer lectures or workshops on the latest developments and the trends, targeting both professionals and students. The last one is our Women in Power program, led by our China team. So the mission is to empower women's leadership in energy, environment, and climate field to build a platform to connect the female professionals. So if you're interested in these events, please follow up our newsletter and please stay in tune. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Professor Daniel Kammen. I'm very excited that Professor Kammen can join us today to share his thoughts on how the current pandemic is impacting our climate, energy, and economy. So he has a very broad and abundant experience from both technology side to policy, as well as from industry to academia. So as for right now, Professor Kammen is currently the director of Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. He's also class of 1935 distinguished professor at the UC Berkeley. And meanwhile, he holds parallel appointments in the Energy and Resource Group, Goldman School of Public Policy, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. He also shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize due to work with IPCC, And also we are very honored that Professor Kammen is currently our board advisor. Without further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Kammen. Hi, Professor Kammen, can you hear me?
I sure can. How are you all doing?
Okay, great. I will pass the mic to you. Let me unshare my screen.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm going to share my screen and share some slides, but they're really just to guide the conversation. There's a lot of interesting things that we can talk about. And I'll start with the slides, but really we're going to try to reserve a lot of time for the conversation. Let me just load them up right now. And I see the first question already. Are we going to send the slides? Yes, I will send them to our management team afterwards for anybody who wants to download them. Let me just see why it's going. There we go. Okay. And again, we'll talk today about the clean energy transition in the time of COVID, both how this changes things and hopefully some of the opportunities that come from this tragedy in terms of making a difference as we go. And so I'll cover a number of topics. The biggest thing I want to cover, though, is that I regard what my laboratory does here at Berkeley really as a resource for a bigger conversation. And so during the Q&A, I will put up a number of links, one of which is that if you're interested in the material we cover today, we do offer a summer course. It's entirely online. You can take my class, Energy and Society, classes on economics and climate, classes on water and society. You can do all of them remotely, and in doing so, you earn a Berkeley summer certificate. The course starts on July 1st, which is partially designed so that if you're a student in China at university or even high school, you can take it when your classes end. And so again, I'll post it online, and it's an opportunity to follow up on what we're going to talk about today. Oh, before I go on, I should just say that the website here is my laboratory site. After the talk happens today, we will post the link on this website, RAEL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And for those of you who use Twitter, I put the Twitter feed at the bottom. We'll also post a link there. And you can find myself on WeChat as well, if that's the preferred method for you. So we have a number of ways to stay connected after this conversation.
Professor Kammen, I think,
yes.
Are you sharing your screen?
Oh, you can't see?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought it was being shared. Didn't realize. Let me go here and share screen. I'm hopefully doing it now. Let's see. There we go. Now I see why it wasn't. Do you see the screen now?
Not yet.
That's strange. Okay. Let's try this.
Yep, it's coming
Okay,
up.
Here we go. Okay, so what I mentioned before, sorry, I thought I was already sharing, was the two resources. One is the website of the laboratory, RAEL, and the other is Twitter, for those of you who use it. I know that not so common in China, but we tweet about once a day from the projects in the lab. Today's tweet will be about this webinar, and we can also find us on WeChat. I'll try to post a similar picture here, and on the laboratory site, we'll post the slides and also a link to the webinar after it's been posted. So hopefully those are ways to stay in touch with us as we go. And again, in the chat box at the end, I'll post the link if you would like to take our summer courses or certificate. I think the first thing to note when we think about climate and COVID is that for some very bad reasons, we've seen some very good changes in air quality. When we look at the levels of carbon dioxide and NOx pollution over China, we see up to a 50% reduction, as you can see in these charts here, not because it's a good thing, but because we've seen such a slowdown in economic activity. And the same is true in the United States. If we look at the N2O levels over our major cities last year and this year, going from the left graph to the right, you can see some dramatic reductions. And this is interesting because it means that in the matter of weeks, we were able to dramatically cut pollution. And the question is, can we do it without also crippling the economy? And of course, both in China, where one of the responses to COVID, sadly, was to authorize an increase in coal use, and in the United States, we are giving some subsidies back to polluting industries. So both in the US and China, there are some good things happening in response to COVID, but there's also some very bad things. And we know from a climate basis that we must change our energy system dramatically. And so while the short-term story that we can in fact quickly clean the air, that's a good thing, but obviously we have to do so in a way now without crippling our economic activity. And just in the United States, if we look at the unemployment numbers, we don't have as good numbers from China, but some of my students at Tsinghua and at Renmin University in Beijing are looking at these numbers for China right now. Just the data appears a little more slowly. You can see these periods of time when our unemployment levels went up. We call them recessions. And then what we've seen most recently is an unemployment level that has not been seen in the United States since what we call the Great Depression. And this curve, very flat for a long time with a spike, should remind you of another curve. That's this curve for CO2 levels, where we see what we call the hockey stick. Relatively low levels for a long time and then suddenly a spike up. And obviously what we need to do is to avoid the spike in emissions and in unemployment, and do so in a way where we use this terrible situation right now under COVID to push us to switch our energy system, not just to shut it down as we've seen so far. And so while the COVID crisis has our attention right now, I think the most important lesson is that there are a number of things that we can learn from it as we think about a new energy economy that really takes advantage of the lessons. And so one of the first things, of course, is that in almost every movie you watch online, whether it's a movie like 2012 or the Chinese movie Wandering Earth, or any of these science fiction movies, they almost always begin with some government scientist, like some government agency ignoring a scientist. And while COVID is serious, I think this curve really tells the story that while COVID is severe, it's nothing compared to what the damages from climate change could do to us. And some governments recognize this. Some, like my own in the United States, clearly don't understand this yet. So we need to teach them and teach them quickly. Part of the reason why it's such a severe story is that if we look at the path that we used to be on before the Paris Agreement, we were talking about 3 degrees C or even 4 degrees or 5 degrees Celsius of warming, which would mean that essentially everyone on the planet was subject to heat waves. Maybe half the people were subject to extreme water stress, and we had issues of crops and habitat degradation. If we jump to what we now have agreed to by all countries except my own, because we have a certain orange president, the 1.5 degree target would cut those damages from heat waves and water stress roughly in half, and would not make climate change go away, but it would make it far more manageable. And this is really the world that we need to be in, which is why we need to work hard on the science and technology, but also very quickly and hard on the politics. So if I were to summarize the lessons that are emerging from COVID, one of them is that there's really no substitute for investing in research. And we can see that because the nations that have done best under COVID, in particular, I'm talking about Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea, all learned very important lessons from SARS and MERS. They invested in research, they invested in testing, they let the science be their guide as opposed to fighting it. Unfortunately, I have a president in the United States who I don't consider my president, who is fighting it, and that's part of the problem. But that lesson is true everywhere. And as well as some places like South Korea have done on climate, no one, on COVID, no one has done that well on climate yet. One of the early lessons that we're learning is that our supply chains, whether it's food or toilet paper or masks or respirators, these are very vulnerable. And while COVID is a disruption, climate change can be a game changer. And so if you think that tipping points can happen fast with COVID, we know that they can happen even more rapidly from climate change. The other lesson, which is a good one, is that we're all in this together. As much as COVID affects everyone and the rich are able to insulate themselves, ultimately we all get these illnesses. And so making sure we find ways to recognize that we all must do collective solutions. It's no good if South Korea only responds or if Singapore only responds. We have to make it a global effort or we'll risk reinfection. And if you don't mind a crude analogy, we've described that here as the problem of having a peeing section in a swimming pool. That might sound good, but it doesn't really help in the end. The other feature is that what we do individually matters. Covering our mouth, wearing masks, educating ourselves or neighbors about climate change. These are all things that make our collective solutions easier, and they make it easier for us to talk to policymakers, to elected officials, to big companies. The other feature is that if we don't make this about environmental justice, protecting the poorest, the most marginalized, whether those are Uyghurs in Northwest China or those are African Americans in the United States, if we don't make this a just solution, we won't have a solution. And we all have issues where we have been either actively or just by our lack of action, part of efforts that have been environmentally unjust to some of the poorest, most marginalized. And so we have to recognize that as a past failing. One of the opportunities, I'll come back to this in the end, is that at least we're having a dialogue about how to invest in good climate strategies as we think about COVID. So while I mentioned that both in the United States and in China, we have seen some efforts to give money to polluting coal and oil and gas companies, that's really a bad investment. And as much as it might appeal to certain groups, that does not make sense. The sort of thing that makes much more sense would be to utilize the stimulus packages that every country is going to be doing to get their economy started as an opportunity for a green stimulus instead. In the United States, we should invest in electric vehicles, in energy programs for low-income communities. In China, it should not be a subsidy for coal. It should be an effort to invest in the new green technologies. In Europe, they're talking about a green stimulus, but at the same time, Germany is looking to fund coal plants in Italy. We're seeing problems everywhere where we're sneaking fossil fuel money into the equation, and that is not a good strategy. Again, I'll come back to this in a bit, mainly because 2 weeks ago, a group of us you see here introduced a green stimulus that we've been talking to members of the United States House and Senate about, as well as to one of the two presidential candidates. One of them, of course, is not interested. And this has gotten some press. We'll talk about this at the end in terms of some of the places where we're seeing discussion about a green stimulus, a very large stimulus, several $1 trillion coming onto the table. As we think about the opportunities to green our energy system, I'll take an example in the beginning from my own laboratory. This is a model that I've built of the power system for the Western United States. We call the WEC, W-E-C-C. We build this model for China with partners at Tsinghua University, North China Electric Power University, Chongqing University, and at Renmin University in Beijing. We've built this in Chile, in Nicaragua, in Kenya, and we build these models in partnership with not only academic partners, but also government partners in each area to think about what the power system could look like as we work to meet this 1.5 degree target. So really to fully decarbonize the economy. One of the key technical features is that we have observed this dramatic decrease in the cost of some technologies like solar and now energy storage. And this follows a very interesting physical relationship. We call it a learning curve or Moore's law. And analytically, what we observe from the data is that the price of technologies, again, like solar panels and batteries today, follows a relationship where the slope of this line in log-log space, this power law, has a very constant relationship. And what it means here is that we can project that the price of these technologies will fall at roughly the slope of that line. It's about a 20% slope, meaning every time we double the number of solar panels or batteries or electric vehicles built and deployed, the price drops by about 20%. And that's a very robust relationship. We see it in the energy sector. We see it in terms of consumer goods. We see it for anything you can mass produce. We don't see it for some of the largest centralized station technologies, such as nuclear power plants or dams or aircraft carriers or other things that are quite unique. And we'll come back to that in the end, but it means that we can think about pricing technologies for where they'll be over time. And if you think that solar has reached the end, that's not true. Now we're seeing the introduction of transparent solar panels. We're seeing solar that can float on water, called photovoltaics. We're seeing wearable solar. We're seeing organic dye solar, quantum dot, a range of technologies. And we're seeing similar advances in energy storage. We're seeing it with LED lights. So we can really see a world of continuing innovation as long as we both continue to invest in innovation and we help these technologies into the market. A more technical example is here. This is the learning curve for not one specific energy storage technology, but for a whole bunch. You can see lithium ion on there. You can see for lead acid batteries that aren't changing very much because it's an old technology. For flow batteries, for a whole variety of technologies, for fuel cells, all of which show different slopes, but all roughly the same behavior. And it means in our models and in our investment in research and development, R&D, we can see some really important returns. So in the United States, and I should have done this for China and the US, but I'll just do the US version here. This is a very useful website built by some friends of mine, University of Texas at Austin, and it shows the least cost technology around the country if you built a power plant today. And so what you see here is the world across the United States with no price on carbon. And this shows where natural gas is the cheapest in rust color, wind is cheapest in green, solar in purple, nuclear in light blue. And of course, we all know that the actual price of carbon might be $0 today in the United States federally. It's also $0 today in most of China, but China plans to introduce a carbon price later this year, just as we have in California. If I jump to the price of carbon in California and Quebec, and again soon in China, you can see the map changes. I'll go back a little bit. You can see the amount of solar expands dramatically. Natural gas is the biggest loser here. But economists know that even the market price of carbon does not reflect its social damage. If we go to what my economist friends call the full social cost, that's about $50 a ton. And in the United States, you see that the national map would be dominated by solar, purple, wind, green, with a tiny bit remaining nuclear, and virtually no, but a little bit of natural gas left. That says that in that modeling picture I described before, that model switch, at an economic basis, we could make the switch to renewables quickly if our next investments, like these stimuli packages, really focused on what's coming, not the technologies of the past, but those of the future. And of course, the reason why this is so critical is something you often hear in the news. This is the paper of which I was one of the co-authors that highlighted we really only have 10 years to make this change. And unfortunately, old people, and I count myself as an old person, are not moving fast enough. We need to do this in under 10 years, not to fully do it, although that would be nice, but we need to get these processes underway. We need to switch to a price of carbon. We need to outlaw new natural gas and coal facilities, both in the US, Europe, and in China, even though that sounds scary to many policymakers. But we know we need to do that economically, climate-wise, and in terms of these damages to come. To get to that level, we have several pathways. And I'm just going to focus on the first two, the more gradual one in blue and that middle one in orange. And I highlight that blue curve, that is a 3% per year decarbonization. The yellow curve is a 4% per year sustained over a 30-year decarbonization. I'm going to skip the red curve. I'm going to skip the red curve because the best that China has ever done and the best that California has ever done is to meet the blue curve, 3% per year for 4 or 5 years, let alone a few decades. Neither one of us, not California, not China, have ever sustained the yellow, the 4%. And let's forget the 5%, the red curve. That means we have to get on with the job. But it's not hopeless. Here's global data from the last few years. If you look back at the light blue on the left, over here, in the 1980s, our global rate was about 1 to 1.25% per year. We did a little better in the dark blue, and in the 2015-16 period, we saw that we actually got to that 3% level on a global basis. But for many reasons, one of which is certainly the unfortunate election of Mr. Trump, we have seen a dramatic fall back in the rates more recently. So this graph should really give you hope. We can get to these levels, but also should worry you that it doesn't take much to undo this positive progress. I'll brag a little bit about California because it's important in the sense that it's the world's 5th largest economy, and we've seen some dramatic changes. In 2007, we set a target to be 20% powered by renewable energy by 2010, and we missed that target. We didn't make 20% until 2013, and then we set a target to be 33% in 2020. And while we missed our 2010 target, we met our 2020 target 3.5 years early. We're currently at 37%, well on our way to our 2030 target of 50%. But just recently, what we chose to do was to increase our target to be 100% powered by clean energy by 2045, and at the same time to increase our goal for 2030 up to 60%. And that's why the modeling package I described, Switch, is so important. And that's why things like this, which I'm not sure you can see me with the slides, this is the rebate check that California citizens get based on our carbon market. It's called the California Climate Credit, and you get it on your utility bill once a quarter. And we're hoping that in China, you will also get the same thing when the Chinese carbon market starts later this year. Now, there's a lot of details about our system. This is an op-ed article I wrote that highlights the various pieces of it. The only one I'll really highlight here is that California set a target several years ago to have 1 million solar rooftops. And when we set that target, people thought it wasn't possible. We passed that goal in August. So we passed our goal for 2020, 1 million solar rooftops, more than half a year early. And we also have a target that people also said was impossible, to be at 1 million electric vehicles on the road by this year. We haven't quite made that. We're at about 800,000 now. The only place with more electric vehicles in use than California is China. And I love the Chinese target, 5 million electric vehicles by this year. China didn't quite make it, but just like us, you're on the way. And if we look at our next goal, California is now planning on a target of between 1.5 and 2 million electric vehicles by 2022 or 23. We have some aggressive targets coming. And again, this is an opportunity to use clean energy, but also to build a market for that, because the more and more solar we install, the more we get to a situation where we have excess capacity during the day, and putting them into our vehicles is a very nice place to put it. One of the interesting pieces of our regulation in California is that we said that by the start of this year, January 1st, every new home we build in California has to be powered by renewable energy. And people thought that was impossible. In fact, we build 1 of every 5 homes in the United States. That's not something to be proud of. But California is now living in a system where every new home we build must be powered by renewables, presumably solar, but it could be wind or it could be other technologies. plus aggressive energy efficiency. At the same time, we passed a law for 2030 that says every office building must also be 100% powered by renewables. Now, we know how to do this one now. We already have 1 million solar rooftops. But a brave piece of policy and a difference in how China and California set policy is that we set this policy for 2030 that we don't really know how to do. And this is the sort of thing that by partnering with research groups, partnering with companies, one, we hope we'll learn enough how to do this by 2030. So we've set here a very aggressive goal that is not yet something that's clear that we know how to put in place. One of the interesting features of our experiment in California is that I mentioned we're the 5th largest economy in the world, but also people say, well, is this possible? Can you really invest in all these green technologies and grow the economy? And so here's a very interesting picture. This shows the annual percentage growth in the economy comparing California in yellow to the rest of the United States in black. And you can see most years, California grows at a rate much faster, sometimes a factor of 4 faster than the United States. In fact, the only time when the federal economy outgrew the US economy was in 2009 and 10, where you can see that we all went into a recession. That was the global financial meltdown. And you'll notice that the federal government, the US overall, grew faster than California for 4 years in a row. And I want to highlight that because it's interesting. That's the only years during this period of time when there was a federal stimulus. At that point, to recover from the recession, the Obama administration that I was part of developed an $800 billion federal stimulus. And just remember back, I mentioned the green stimulus of $2 trillion. And when that stimulus money ran out, the California economy again began to grow faster than the US economy overall. And if you look in the last few years, you can see that California has been massively outgrowing the United States overall, despite having the most aggressive green energy goals in the country. And I say that for another reason, and that is that when we look at what the public is interested in, at least in the United States, and now we also know in Europe, that green energy also polls very well. So older politicians who say this is only for the green left, politically left states, this is very strong data. That's not the case. And this poll was done just a few weeks ago by Data for Progress, highlighting how much of an interest there is in green energy technologies. In the US, we're hoping that people vote this way in November and that we change our administration. And I certainly hope this is a lesson to other countries that there's really an opportunity here. And again, this brings me back to this idea about a green stimulus. And I'll highlight this because every country that's thinking about COVID now is thinking about what sort of stimulus package they should put together. And so in this letter that you can download, if you're interested, you can sign on if you agree with it. If you go to that website at themedium.com, you can get to our letter. It's a very long list of investment opportunities, many of which are most suitable to the United States. Some of them are suitable to Malaysia, to Singapore, to China, but I'm really highlighting this right now in terms of the process of getting interest in investing in a clean energy economy. And so in the United States, what we proposed is something we hope is interesting to you, and that is a stimulus package of about $2 trillion. We've also are recommending and are talking to lawmakers and again to presidential candidate Joe Biden. We're not talking to the other candidate for president. And that is to make this something that would renew every year automatically so we don't debate it year after year until unemployment goes down, and to do so in a way that continues to invest in clean energy. And this is again something that we're seeing a number of European countries looking at. Japan is now looking at it. It's something that would make sense for Malaysia. It's something that we think would make sense in China in some ways that I'll highlight as well in the coming slides. This slide is really to put all the details in front of you. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but just to highlight some of the things that we've learned over the last decade in terms of opportunities to do investments that would put people back to work after COVID, and that would make a real difference in terms of jobs and shifting the economy. And so again, I won't do them in detail, but one of the opportunities is to invest in more energy efficient and green housing, particularly for the lowest income people in the United States. That's people in federal housing, that's Native Americans, and to invest in better weatherization of homes, heat pumps, better insulation, better lighting systems, all of which make homes more efficient and also are jobs that people could move into right away. Opportunities to install solar on schools is another strong opportunity because it dramatically improves the quality of life for our children. And again, these are the types of details that come up in each area. In the United States, much more so than in China, where you don't need it as much, but investing in better public transit, giving out low interest loans for green energy projects, investing in electric vehicles are all opportunities to go green and do so in ways where jobs could be put in place right away. On the energy side, one of the most interesting things that's happened in the United States, it started under President Bush, surprisingly to some, expanded under President Obama, and ignored under the current president, is to invest in research. And so the ARPA-E, Advanced Research Projects in Energy, is a program that's been very successful at getting new technologies in place. In fact, I was recently at a clean tech a competition. It actually took place at Tsinghua University. It involved a number of Chinese ministries. State Grid was part of it, NDRC, but so was the United States Department of Energy. Foundations like the Energy Foundation were also there. And they were investing in student teams working on clean tech in terms of batteries, in terms of applications to manage buildings better. And these are really ways to get students from different disciplines involved in clean energy. On the land use side, we could make agriculture much smarter. We could do this in the United States as well in China in terms of electric vehicles for farm use, in terms of rewarding farmers for carbon farming, meaning practices that we can verify that store carbon in the soil, making smarter agriculture. All of these are opportunities. We could set up green banks. This is something that would work well in the United States. We have green banks already in New York and Connecticut. We do not have a federal green bank, nor is there a green bank in China, even if we look at some of the greenest investments by the NDRC. And we could help in the United States, tribal colleges, community colleges. We could invest in green energy training in parts of China that are most at risk, Western Sichuan province, in Tibet and Xinjiang, a number of areas where we could invest much more positively in these areas. And of course, on the international front, making green overseas grants and loans, something that the World Bank can do, something that the US government can do, the Chinese government can do, European governments can do, and that is investing in countries that establish clear plans for how to get to these low carbon goals in the end. We also really need to be clear about some of the mistakes we've made in the past. And no one loves to admit their past mistakes, but we all certainly make them. And instead of trying to bury them, one of the best ways is to acknowledge what went wrong and what could be done differently. So I'll give an example for the United States. One of the areas that we clearly did not think about hard in the beginning is environmental justice. As much as academics in all countries like to talk about environmental justice, we have more examples of not investing in the most needy, in minority groups, in the poorest citizens. And we're seeing that today with COVID, where homeless people in the United States or immigrant communities in some of the poorer areas in Western and Southwestern China are not where we're seeing investment, and we're seeing both higher rates of COVID and suspected unreported rates. Well, that's a social and environmental injustice. In the United States, we have the same problem. Our homeless situation is terrible, but even when we're investing in green energy, we often do it wrong. And so one example of this is that we now know quite clearly that some of our investments in green energy have gone, unfortunately, only to the most affluent. One example of that is something I wrote about in the New York Times last year, along with Scott Wiener, a California state senator. And what we highlighted is that as the economic booms have happened in areas like Silicon Valley in California, around Boston, around Austin, Texas, around Tsinghua University in Beida, we've seen that the rents have gone up incredibly fast. And so unless you are a privileged high-tech worker, you can't afford to live in these places. And what that's meant is that the poorer you are, the further you have to drive or take the public transportation to get to work. And that means that the lowest income people spend the least time with their families, the least time with their children, the least quality of life for those that we say we're trying to uplift. So how do we do something about it? In California, we are working on an effort to make low-income, rent-controlled apartments available near our transit stops. We've tried this twice before in the California legislature, and it's failed twice before, largely on the pushback from the more affluent and primarily white homeowners. We're still working on versions of that. And because many of our past environmental legislations took a long time to pass, we're not at all discouraged. We just think these things take time, like that requirement for every new home to be built in California to generate all its own power. That took us 6 years to pass. So we think this is an example here where we can push back quite hard. Another example that's quite disappointing is that if we look at who has solar in the United States and who doesn't, we see a very clear racial breakdown. In a big machine learning and data science project I did with two former postdocs of mine, Deborah Sunter, who's now a professor at Tufts University in Boston, and Sergio Castellanos, who has just accepted a faculty job at University of Notre Dame. We did a project where we used images of rooftops across the United States. We had data on 60 million roofs. We did quite a bit of machine learning to determine which roof had solar on it and which didn't. And we used that to then track where was the solar. And what we found was surprising and saddening. So what we found was that if you look at who had solar and who didn't, we looked by neighborhood, not by individual rooftop. What we found is that if you were in a community that was more than 51% white or did not have any dominant ethnic group, we call that the non-segregated, the green. If you were in a white-dominated or a non-segregated community, you were over 30% more likely to have solar than if you were in a Latino community, and more than 70% more likely if you were in an African-American dominated community. That result might not scare you because of where the money is, but in this case, we did something else. We controlled for income using census data and people's incomes. In this case, what you see in the graph here is that even when you look across income levels, this is in US dollars, we find that those differences hold. We find that, again, 30% less solar in Latino majority communities across income levels, and up to 50 to 70% in African-American areas. That's an example of a social and environmental injustice. It's not something we're proud of, but it's a lesson we need to learn as we think about what our next programs should be, especially as we think about spending some of this green stimulus money. In fact, one of the really scary features is that if you look at across these communities, in African-American communities, they're almost 50% likely to have no solar at all. Whereas in white communities, only 21% of them have no solar. And we all know that one of the biggest advertisements for a new technology, whether it's a flat screen TV or a barbecue or a solar panel, is seeing it on your neighbor's roof. And so if we don't see that on our own, in our own communities, we're less likely to install it. This means that in the next wave with this green stimulus, we have to be smarter. And we're partnering right now in Europe, in Germany and Italy. I'd like to do this in China as well, although the data is harder to get, in terms of looking at which apartment buildings have solar and which don't, by looking at the ethnic and also socioeconomic makeup of those communities. That gets into some sensitive territory, but if we want to recognize that we can learn from our mistakes, it's these types of data we're going to have to reveal to ourselves. Again, all of these are really examples of opportunities that we can make to both invest in a green transition, to learn from the COVID process. And as we move into the question part of the meeting here, again, where I'll post some of the information like how to register for our summer online courses, I just want to highlight that one of the things that my laboratory tries to do is to build these kind of partnerships. So at present, we have 5 visiting PhD students from China staying with us for a year or 2. We have 2 currently from Tsinghua, 1 from North China Power University, 1 from Beijing Renmin University, and 1 from Chongqing, as well as a postdoc from Tsinghua. We also have 2 visiting students in the laboratory from East Africa, and it's these kinds of partnerships where we can build up not just good research results, but long-term partnerships with not only individuals, but also the universities or the think tanks or companies they come from. We can build some new opportunities. And so if not for COVID, this week I would actually have been in China because we had scheduled for this week in March, a week-long visit to BYD in Shenzhen, where we were going to talk about an electric vehicle partnership using some of the data that I showed you here. So again, I'll stop so we can have full time for Q&A, but I want to thank you all for attending. And yes, we'll make the slides and the webinar tape available to you all. So I'll return screen control here, and we can now really get into a dialogue about many of these topics. So thank you all so much for being on.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Professor Kammen. This is really great talk. A lot of very interesting information and insights. We do get many questions, and for the audience, if you have questions, please keep typing your question in the chatting window, and I will start some of the questions we have selected. So the first one is, so how do you define clean energy? So a lot of the clean power sources still have environmental impacts, like for example, mining for silicon and also habitat for disruption for hydro. And also, I know that for Senate 100 bill, it does not include nuclear engineering and large hydro, right? So how do you think?
So this is a great question. I'm going to try to keep the answer short, but this question is really a whole course. So one of the aspects of thinking about energy systems is that if you only look at the hardware and not the manufacturing and the disposal, just like the question asked, you're not doing a full accounting. So one topic that has become very standard in the United States and standard in China is to study what we call life cycle analysis. And that means that we don't just look at, for example, what's the cost of a solar panel. We also look at how much energy did it take to make it. For a battery, where did lithium come from? Was it from Bolivia? Was it mined sustainably? Or for your cell phone, many of the materials in your phone came from conflict regions of the Congo, and they were mined illegally, often with some real human rights abuses. So we have a partnership with Google to look at sustainable supply chains, and we do so in terms of thinking about recycling what we can, and also finding ways to work with communities, whether they are exploited miners in the Congo or in Canada or in some of the mines in Shaanxi province, so that the people who are at the dirty end of our supply chains get some of the benefits. So that's part of the answer. And then there's the other part of your question, which is also interesting, and that is, which technologies do we define as renewable? When I showed the picture for California, one of the things that I didn't get into was, what do we count? In California, we count solar, wind, geothermal energy, ocean energy, tidal and wave, and offshore wind as renewable. We count bioenergy only if it's sustainable. And that's not very much bioenergy. You'll notice I didn't say nuclear, and I didn't say large hydro. Now, I'm a professor of nuclear engineering, and while I would like to count nuclear, in California we don't. And we don't because we don't think that the waste is managed in a sustainable way. Now, that varies. In New York State, I'm from a small town in upstate New York where Cornell University is. New York counts nuclear and they count large hydro as renewable. China, you count both nuclear and large hydro. Much of Europe counts nuclear. Germany does not. Germany and California are very similar on that. So the definitions vary, and different people are investing in different parts of that. And so it really is a definition that each place gets to choose. I certainly hope that China never has a bad nuclear accident, but that was why California chose not to include nuclear. And I'll just answer one other question that's related here. At Google, we work with their sustainable supply chain team. It's led by a very dynamic researcher named Alyssa Newman. And we have a partnership where we're installing mini grids in the Congo and managing those energy resources, in particular to benefit women, because women do much of the smelting of the tungsten and the cobalt and other materials that come out of those mining processes.
Okay, great, thanks, Professor Kammen. So actually, on that topic, there's also a question that, so given the last nuclear power plant is decommissioned in California, and also I see that you're strongly support for nuclear fusion based on one of your previous talk. So do you think California government risks both intellectual capital and bureaucratic and industry infrastructure to support the rapid fusion adoption if the technology is developed?
So your questions are better than my answers. And again, I answered too long last time. I'll try to keep this answer shorter, but it's a great question. In California, we don't need to install nuclear technology, at least not the current technology. And I say that because California has such good wind and solar and geothermal that we can make our goals without. But if you remember back to the map I showed, the least cost technology included some nuclear in some of the colder parts of Michigan and Wisconsin. And whether that is a good idea, given the risk, is something that will have to be decided state by state. But I highlight that because in California, I don't think we're at any risk of not having nuclear companies here because so much of the expertise is here. In fact, there are a whole range of new nuclear companies. Bill Gates himself has invested in several. And while several of them have their offices in Washington State and in Oregon, I'm talking about TerraPower and NuScale, they also have research operations here in California because there's so much expertise here. So if nuclear can really make the transition and become a least cost and safe technology, some people think it is today. I personally do not, but I'm hopeful because I am a professor of nuclear engineering. Then I am convinced California would change its definition. Now, just to be clear, California says no nuclear, Germany says no nuclear, but we both cheat. California imports nuclear from Arizona, and Germany imports nuclear from France. And so the two places that like to say we have no nuclear, we're cheating. And so that relates to a question I see here, and that is, what about thorium? Now, thorium is interesting because it's harder to divert thorium radioactive products into weapons. Thorium does not give you a smaller radioactive footprint, but it makes it harder to make plutonium. And India and the United States have the world's largest supply of thorium. That's meant there's interest groups in both countries to build thorium reactors. But the simple truth is that in the 1950s and 60s, the United States looked at thorium and they looked at uranium, and for better or worse, we decided for the US, it was not possible to have a full research and development program for both. So our government made a choice on uranium. The downside was that making plutonium is easier from uranium, much easier. But the upside was we made a technically informed but political choice to invest in uranium. And so, no, I don't think that thorium has much of a future. Not that it doesn't technically, but unless the United States were to get on board with thorium, which I don't think we will, or China, which I don't think you will because you don't have much thorium that we know of, I'd be surprised if it makes a comeback. I would, however, say that the push towards smaller modular reactors means that we might be able to get on that learning curve I showed you before for nuclear in a way that we're not today. And there's another nuclear technology we haven't mentioned, and that's fusion. And I would predict that by 2070 or 2080, when I won't be around, unfortunately, but you all will likely be around, that the world will be largely powered by fusion. Just some of it will be 93 million miles away, and some of it will be on the Earth's surface. And by 93 million miles away, what I mean is solar power is fusion. And I'm hoping that by then we have significant amounts of fusion from terrestrial plants, such as some of the research on fusion taking place at MIT, here at Berkeley, at Tsinghua, and elsewhere. But that's really forecasting for what will come down the line. There is a question here about France. France does run 70% on nuclear today, but France is not building significant numbers of new reactors. In fact, the economics of nuclear are not favorable today because the more we invest in intermittent sources like solar and wind and storage, the harder it is for nuclear to compete, because nuclear is simply more expensive than solar and wind, much more expensive than solar, more expensive than wind, and even more expensive than what we think offshore wind will be in the very near future. So there's a really interesting opportunity that the nuclear world will have to take on. And right now, it's the billionaires, the Bill Gates, the Jack Ma's. They will need to invest significantly in nuclear to demonstrate that it has a potential. I think it does, but after 40 years of government investment in nuclear not making it economically viable, we'll now need to see if a new, more private sector model. And so I promised I would go faster in my answers. I didn't that time, I'm sorry. The next question, I will go quicker, sorry.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Professor Kammen. So speaking of China, so there's a question that China now is considering over like 34 trillion RMB investment plans. And if we want to direct them to our green stimulus, as you mentioned, however, the size of the investment in emerging technologies, renewable energy can never compete with traditional infrastructure investment. So therefore, even we can convince the government to invest in renewable and NEV, this is only a very small percentage. How do you think of this?
Yeah, so I disagree. I don't think that renewables can't compete. I think that even in China, where you say that coal is very cheap, it's not. When you look at the damage to agriculture and the damage to health, coal is much more expensive than solar or wind in China. And with the cost of batteries coming down so much, we still need investments in transmission, in battery storage systems. I actually think that even in China today, before the carbon market launches, renewables are cheaper than fossil energy.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Another question is regarding supply chain. So how might the supply chain get disrupted due to the climate change effects? And what can we do to make it more resilient or resistant?
Yeah, so this I think is one of the really interesting questions that we're still learning from COVID. We've already seen grocery stores run short on materials. We've seen a big discussion that the people that bring us our food, the people that serve us in restaurants, that clean our homes, the people who have lower paying jobs, we put them at risk for our benefit. And we put them at risk by not providing masks, by not providing good health care, by not finding ways to test them for COVID. And so that is an environmental injustice. It's also one that demonstrates what's really valuable in society. And in many cultures, We're paying the lowest wages to the jobs that are the most important for our daily necessities. And this is something that we need to change. And this is really a huge problem. And I would say this problem of greed, is a much bigger problem than climate change. We're demonstrating that even though we want groceries delivered to our door and Amazon to bring us boxes to our homes, we're still not willing to respect those workers. We're not willing to pay them reasonable minimum wages. We don't do it in the United States. We don't do it in Europe. We don't do it in China. And so this is definitely a problem in our system right now, where we could learn a great deal from the problems of COVID.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Professor Kammen. And yeah, speaking of that, and there's another question regarding like any policy side. So how do we design energy policies that lead to a climate friendly and equitable society? And what are the additional considerations for policy design in developing countries? And if you compare developed countries and developing countries, what are the difference in terms of the challenges and the opportunities?
Yeah, so great question. This is something that, again, won't be the same answer everywhere. We certainly know that the policies that work well in one place, the policies that work in Shaanxi province are different than they are in Pearl River Delta. They're different in New York versus California. But we're certainly learning that if you don't put a price on carbon, you need other tools to effectively recognize the downside of pollution. So that's one area where there's an important opportunity we need to take advantage of. Another aspect is that even when you have a price on carbon, you still need to help these new technologies into the market. And so there's this question from Chris Gassman here, but does the paper we highlight cover the levelized cost, including health supply? No, it doesn't. This is really what we call the overnight cost. You can increase the carbon price. And in the graphs I showed, I went to the $20 a ton, that's the price of carbon in California today, or $50 a ton, that's what economists think is the social cost. That does include health and some of the end-of-life costs of different technologies. So there are ways to put into the models. In that model switch, we do use these numbers, but most governments do not. Actually, under President Obama in the United States, we started to use the social cost of carbon. We don't do it right now under President Trump. That won't surprise anybody. And unfortunately, in China today, you also don't do it, largely because of the relationship of the central government and of the provincial party governments in terms of pricing out projects. And so this is an area where different places will need different mechanisms to include a price. But as of today, we don't do that yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question is, so with renewable energy on the track to hit 60% or higher in the next 10 years, which energy solution do you think as the best candidate to flatten the curve?
Yeah, so I don't think there is a best candidate. I think that it's a mixture of all of these. You saw in the United States, we had that map where even at $20 a ton, for most of the United States, solar and wind were the cheapest technologies. That's also true in China, but because coal is subsidized in China, it's hard to see the renewables being the cheapest. When China launches the carbon price, we think the price will be about $20 a ton, 20 US dollars a ton. And at that price, onshore wind and onshore solar will be cheaper than coal. And in some work that we're currently doing with Chongqing University and Tsinghua, we think that massive offshore wind in China will also become cheaper than coal within the next few years. And we'll release that paper in the next few weeks.
Got you. And speaking of that, actually, so because renewables such as solar and wind, they are right now they are incentivized by government in some way, and also they are actually bringing a lot of challenges to the grid, right, for the utilities to handle on the grid side. And with that, all of those like challenges brought by solar and wind, do you think like in long term is still like cost-effective way?
Yeah, so again, I would push back on this. I don't think this is right. People like to say that solar and wind are challenging because they're intermittent, But with the cost of storage coming down so rapidly, it is not hard to invest in energy storage and in renewables and still make it cheaper than coal. That's the case in California, where the last 3 proposals to our state government for natural gas were all rejected in favor of energy storage plants. That's something that also could take place in China. It doesn't today because right now it's complicated in China, because not only are you launching a carbon price, but you're also reforming the regional you're also reforming the regional energy markets, starting with the southern grid. And so there are some things to be worked out in the detail, but if you do true life cycle costing, in particular with a carbon price, I think that the renewables are in fact cheaper. Now, that's not what you hear from many of the rich industrialists around the world in the United States and Europe and in China. But when we look at the numbers, including even this modest carbon price, we think renewables plus storage, so reliable renewables, are actually cheaper. And any place like California or China that's ramping up the number of electric vehicles dramatically actually has a place where you can store any excess electricity very effectively. And if you have enough capacity to meet your daytime demands from wind and solar, you generally have an oversupply at other times of the day. That means giving people incentives to charge their electric vehicles, or as one of the question notes, to make hydrogen with that electricity, to use that hydrogen for storage or for intercity transportation. These are all interesting opportunities to really invest in a clean grid, and one where storage becomes central to the story.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, another question regarding climate change. So what do the tipping point of climate change look like, and how fast can change occur? So the public's perception is that climate change is happening very gradually.
Yeah, so I'm hoping this view will change. We've already seen that climate change is happening very not gradually. People just don't like to say it's climate change. Last year in California, we had 10,000 structures burned down in our fire season, and almost 10% of Australia burned last year. That was because of climate change. That was a fast change. That was as damaging as COVID, but we don't think of it that way. So we are going to need to understand, and unfortunately, old people like myself don't seem to get the lesson. This is something where young people are going to really have to make a change. We've seen this in the argument made by Greta Thunberg. We've seen this by the very brave Chinese activist who made the YouTube video under the dome that was banned in China about the health impacts of burning coal. And so we've seen very brave young people. I see that a good friend of mine, Athena Ballesteros, is on. She knows very well about a very important program in the Philippines where she's from, where a company invested in turning taxis, shared taxis, into electric taxis. The taxis in Manila are called jeepneys, and this company made electric jeepneys, and they first recharged them using biopower, and then they recharged them using solar. That was an example of something that people didn't think would work, but soon after it started, there was an effort to say every new taxi that gets licensed in downtown in Manila, in Makati, would be electric. In China and in the United States, we could easily say the same thing. Now, I work in Shenzhen and Guangzhou. In Shenzhen, they converted 100% of the taxis to be electric. And in Guangzhou, they converted all of the bus fleet, 11,000 buses, to be electric. And they had to build more charging stations. They had to find they built new apps so you could know when charging stations had openings. That's something we could do in the United States. That's something they could do in Europe. And these are all opportunities to demonstrate how superior renewable energy can be if we only find a way to invest in it. And it gets me back to the question that Martha Turner and Ross Henley raised, and that is one of the interesting technologies that has applications in cities and in rural areas are mini grids. Because of the falling prices of solar and wind in particular, and due to the information technology revolution in our phones, we can now build utilities that serve 1, 10, or 100 homes very cheaply. So we need to invest in more of these mini grids because they have an opportunity to serve underserved communities. Some of the least well-served farming communities in Western Sichuan province, some of the remote communities in Tibet and Xinjiang, Xinjiang, these are things that we can invest in. Inner city parts of the United States, immigrant communities of immigrants in Paris, in Berlin. These are all areas where mini grids could provide energy for places that are neglected. And we could build mini grids in block by block, like a blockchain, so that one mini grid can sell power to the next and can ultimately sell power to the utilities. And so these are opportunities where mini grids give us a new platform that we can serve both urban and rural communities in ways we couldn't do before.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Professor Kammen. Another question from the survey was that what challenges did you or may you face when trying to communicate the science of issues like climate change or COVID-19 to non-scientists?
Well, I don't think it's non-scientists so much. I think it's people who are choosing to be greedy. And the greediest human being that I've now seen is the current US president, who doesn't seem to care about science, doesn't seem to care about poor people, doesn't seem to care about women. And so I find most people are willing to listen. Unfortunately, the United States made a mistake in our last election. And if we could undo that mistake in the next election, I actually think we would have a global set of leaders that were more or less aligned. We have problems in Brazil, we have problems in Italy as well as the United States, but if the US were to make a change and stop being the world's pig when it comes to carbon and get back to that famous handshake between the presidents of the United States and China when President Xi and President Obama shook at the APEC summit and set their own climate deal, I actually think we could quickly move back to a much more positive situation. And so there's lots of people who don't want to listen, but unfortunately the most important person who doesn't listen today sits in the White House.
Another question is, so for large threats like climate change and the COVID-19, is there a better or more effective way besides the existing organizations such as WHO or the IPCC to better prepare for and combat situations like this in the future? And what have we learned from COVID-19 pandemic as a society?
So this question is really interesting. I'm hoping that every university will offer a course in the coming years exactly on this question. What have we learned? What are the good institutions in the world? I happen to think that the WHO is a great institution. And many of you might have seen that in another act of stupidity, the US president has decided to stop funding the WHO. This makes absolutely no sense. This is just an effort to distract from his own incompetence. I hate to say such blunt things, but that's what we're seeing. And so I think that we've got some interesting lessons. The IPCC is not perfect. It's made some major mistakes, but it's also a way to bring researchers together across governments. When we had a global effort to think about the law of the sea, we saw most countries signing on. Interestingly, Norway and Japan, normally very progressive, fought against the law of the sea because they didn't want to cut down their whaling. That makes absolutely no sense, and it means that countries that can be progressive in some areas can be absolutely going the wrong direction on others. Right now, the United States is going the wrong direction on climate. I would like to think that we can learn from the law of the sea. We can learn from CITES, which is the World Biodiversity Treaty. And one of the things that is true everywhere, but is particularly true in China, and this is not going to be fun to hear, is that whether COVID began with people in the Wuhan seafood market eating bat or not, we don't know. I myself, I've eaten bat in the rainforests of Borneo in Malaysia and in Kalimantan, Indonesia. But one thing we know for sure is that the biggest villain in the world trade in rare animals, in tiger paw, in the hands of gorillas, in shark fins, in pangolin. This is China. Everyone is to blame, but China is the #1 country to blame in driving the world's market for the rare animals. That's something that no one in China should be proud of. In fact, I could show a picture when I went to the tombs in Xi'an. As I walked through the small villages on the outside, I saw the pelts of rare red mountain foxes, and they were being sold openly. Now, every country has problems. I've criticized the United States, but the world biodiversity problem is one we can't solve without solving it in China.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the chatting window is, so what is holding back mainstream investment into renewable? My personal view is without a global and sustainable carbon value, it is difficult to justify commercial activities yet, despite the cost of the development is reducing. And speaking of the carbon market, we see it becomes more vulnerable in extreme market conditions, such as 2008 GFC and COVID-19. So can you share some perspectives on the carbon market?
Yeah, interesting question. So there are two schools of thought on this. One is that the carbon markets around the world need to be linked. So there can be a global trading price. Another group of economists think, no, we don't need them to be linked. We just need prices in different areas. And then there's places, and California used to be one, where we said we don't need a carbon price because we have such good regulations in each area. We have a requirement for clean energy. We call it the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. We have a requirement for clean fuels. I wrote it. We call it the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. We have regulations in different areas. And these have all worked quite well. And right now, 2020, they are effectively a larger price than our carbon price of $20 a ton. At the same time, however, California introduced a carbon price. As I mentioned before, it's $20 a ton. And we did so because while all of these different rules are useful, they're also very complicated, and each one has to be fought over individually. And so in the end, it would be much simpler, the economists say more efficient, to have a carbon price that extends over North America. Right now, California and Quebec, we're not even physically connected. We share a carbon market. And so carbon markets could be created anywhere. I do think we need a price on carbon, but it doesn't have to be very high. And the reason why is that just having a price means that you and I as individuals and companies and governments have to do the math. They have to figure out the cost. And as soon as you do the math, what you find out is what I tried to say in the talk, and that is that renewable energy is often much, much cheaper than fossil energy, but many people don't know it yet. So while a carbon price is helpful, I'm not even sure we actually need much of one if we required everyone to be honest about the mathematics. And right now, we don't require them to be honest because we know worldwide the subsidies we give for fossil fuels range between $500 billion a year and $5 trillion a year, depending on whose math. And even at the low end, $500 billion a year, that means we subsidize fossil fuels. The US government is guilty, the Chinese government is guilty, the government of Iran is guilty, the government of Norway, we're all guilty of subsidizing fossil fuels. And even the low end, $500 billion a year of subsidy alone, not even all the cost, that's more than the total global investment in renewables. So if we simply remove that subsidy or balanced it out with a carbon price, if you want to get more economic, I think that this switch to renewables is something that we could do not in 3 decades, between now and 2050. I think we could do it in 1 decade.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kammen. Another question is regarding community solar. So do you think community solar is an effective way to implement solar for disadvantaged communities? Other states like Minnesota and Colorado have made it work, but California seems stuck.
Yeah, California has been stuck. Yes, I think it works. I have a project we call the Eco Block. We've taken 40 homes in a low-income part of Oakland, California, and we're installing solar on all the rooftops, but we're putting all of the energy into one central battery in someone's garage, and then sending the power back to the homes, and the excess goes to the grid. They sell it to the utility. California does need to change that law. It's something we're working on. There's a few proposed legislation, but we have not been successful, like, as you say, they have in Colorado and elsewhere. But I think community solar makes a lot of sense. And in China, it makes even more sense because so few people live in their own single-family homes. So many people live in apartments and block homes. And so installing group solar is a much more effective way to go, not just for China, but for much of the poorer parts of the world where even higher percentage of people live in homes they don't own.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kammen. Another question is, what is your view on the future of tax credits for renewables? So what can industry participants do should the tax incentives phase out?
Yeah, well, so in our green stimulus, we asked that they be turned back on, but the case is getting kind of weak because the real issue isn't the cost. Right now, as I said before, renewables, solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels, but the problem is the upfront cost. And the best way to think about it is that when you build a natural gas power plant, about 30% of the cost is to build it up front. 70% is the natural gas you purchase down the line. Well, a builder doesn't care about that cost down the line. A builder cares about the overnight cost just to build the plant. That means that banks and you and I are subsidizing that natural gas plant or that coal plant. Whereas for energy efficiency or solar or wind with no fuel costs, we're doing everything up front. So one of the big changes needed are green banks that give better rates for renewable energy because those are better long-term investments. One of the big battles in the United States is the battle over divestment. University of California, as a system, chose to divest. Some major investors have chosen to divest, but the university I went to, Harvard, is fighting against divestment. And it's a disgusting example of a university that's hanging on to its fossil fuel investments, even though they look riskier and riskier. And so any place that chooses to move to clean energy has to recognize that if you don't also divest from dirty investments, you're not really divesting. And so this is an opportunity that we're going to have to push politically because unfortunately the new president of Harvard, who just had COVID, is not part of this effort to divest, and he should be.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Professor Kammen. We have 2 minutes left for this webinar. I think we have a lot of interesting discussions here, and we can have maybe 2 more questions. So one is, how do we get to a better set of economic indicators that value sustainability, equity, and economic stability for the average citizen?
Easy answer, a social cost of carbon. I think China should adopt a social cost of carbon. It might be a different price in the United States. We used to have a social cost of carbon, but we made a mistake in the 2016 presidential election. I think that would be a very straightforward way. We should require us to use it, but we should institute a social cost, not just a market price for carbon.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Let me see whether there's any other last question in the...
CCS.
Okay.
Let's do that one.
Okay, yes, the question is, it's a little long. Okay, China's pathway for hydrogen economy is looking at the coal-based hydrogen in the medium term while promoting renewable hydrogen with industrial bioproducts as supplements. The renewables hydrogen and the coal-based H2 plus CCS in the long term. Is there anything we could do to accelerate renewable hydrogen and the maturity and the market availability for CCS?
So this is such an interesting area because clearly that's right. CCS might be necessary. I personally am not in favor of CCS. Not that it won't be useful if we really drew carbon out of the system, but the problem is that in today's economy, any investment in CCS is not an investment in renewables. I'm not saying it's not useful. I'm not saying that in India and China and West Virginia, they don't want it, but it doesn't make sense to me compared to investing in clean energy. So any investment in new gas, in new coal, even if it's going to produce hydrogen, to me, should only be done if we think it works, including that social cost of carbon. Many people will disagree with me, but investments in green hydrogen make a lot of sense. We could make hydrogen the way biological organisms do, the way termites do. We could find ways to use rotting vegetation. There's a lot of things we could do to start the hydrogen economy. And as we've seen in China, there's a push for electric vehicles within cities, but hydrogen to go between cities. And that is a very smart strategy, and it's one that I hope California follows China. I know we're at time. I want to thank you all. I really appreciate it, and like you heard from the presenters, we'll try to post both the slides and the webinar video.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Kammen. This is really great talk, and thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on this topic. And thanks all for the audience attending. We just want to bring your attention to our 2 other future coming events. So one is the Lunch on April 25th, and one is the Innovation Start Mixture, talking about utility innovation trend analysis on May 7th, as well as our Inspire Summit in September. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attending, and special thanks to Professor Kammen. And if you are interested to get to know more about our organization, please use this email and also follow us on our LinkedIn. And we also have the Slack channel later to get people connected. So if Professor Kammen, if you are interested also, you can join our channel to keep talking, keep having this conversation going on.
Will do. Thank you all. 谢谢.
Okay, great. 谢谢. Thank you. Hope everyone's staying healthy and see you next time. Bye-bye.